Hello, 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 and welcome. Welcome to the first live stream of Deep Noetics, where I'm going to be talking on my own. And we're going to begin this with a general overview of what we're going to do in this series. Namely, we're going to be speaking about power. And this is all in preparation to lead up to a course I will be teaching at Halcyon Guild this year, presumably beginning on the 26th of May, namely on power, on philosophies of power, on different descriptions of power, and how they can be understood in combination to get a more coherent and a more holistic understanding of power. Please, if you support my work and if you want to support my work that I keep making this kind of content, consider subscribing to my Substack, supporting me on my Substack with any amount you see fit. And this way I can write more, I can prepare more for these live streams, and dedicate more resources into the production of this kind of content. If you're interested in getting more of this, please leave a like, please subscribe. So, why is the study of power important? Why is it relevant? Now, it can be relevant for different things. It can be relevant for starting a political movement, strategizing in a political movement. But that's not necessarily the goal here. The goal here is to understand it in a more authentic manner and therefore not fall prey to the illusions we may have about power. And this is exactly why we focus on the specific illusions or delusions people may have about power. This is why the title of the stream is what most people get wrong about power. There's been different works written on this topic specifically. For example, you have The Political Illusion by Jacques Ellul. You also got other more contemporary writers such as Nima Parvini's The Populist Delusion. What they're essentially doing is they are presenting the topic of power as something that is commonly misunderstood by most people, as something having an essential core that is misunderstood, that is not obvious to the common observer, to the, you could say, common intuition or common sense, but something that lays behind a veil that needs to be explored, needs to be figured out and unveiled. Why is that necessary? It is necessary because, especially in our modern time, power is seen as something that is evenly distributed. It is claimed to be held by the people. It is claimed to be exerted by the masses in a democratic process. But in many ways, this exact illusion about this process is what subjugates us even further to power without us truly understanding it. And the most common way to deal with this is to apply various kinds of ideologies to it. For example, people have an inherent problem with the way power is structured, with the way power is distributed in the system, but they also favor a kind of will of the people. They favor a participation of the public, so they can't have a problem with democracy per se. It is actually something else. It is that democracy has been corrupted, that we don't actually have real democracy, but what we have is a particular ideological enemy. So, for example, if I am a communist, I will say the enemy is capitalism. We don't have democracy because democracy has been co-opted by the political class. I'm just seeing that someone's complaining about the audio. Thanks for the information. Let me see. Is it better now? Is it coming from both ends now? Thanks, Daniel, for the information. So, yeah, just give me feedback if it's better now. So essentially, if I was someone from a left-wing persuasion, a socialist, a communist, I would say that democracy is not real. It has been co-opted, has been subverted by a capitalist class. And if I am a libertarian or someone from a different persuasion, I will say that democracy is only a scam, it is only an illusion, but it has been subverted by communism. What's actually behind it is an evil communist cabal or something of that sort. And what I'm striving to do here is to actually pierce through the veil of these ideologies and get past all of these illusions we may have about particular ideologies and try and look at it from a holistic perspective, one that cannot be necessarily traced to a particular ideology. Hey, Upcycle Club. Is that you, Hades? If I remember correctly, it's your channel, right? So the idea is that ideologies, especially the radical ideologies, they were presented at a particular time. They were presented at a particular fragile time, specifically in the beginning of the 20th century. You can pin down different times for different countries, but a great example would be something like Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany in the last century was particularly fragile. It was particularly unstable, but it was also particularly open to radical political ideologies. So in a sense, at that time, you actually had a sense of an open marketplace of ideas, because no matter how radical you were, no matter how violent your ideas were, you could propagate them, you can openly express them, and you can run for office there. Many of the ideologies, whether left-wing or right-wing, would just not be possible to run for any kind of power campaign in today's systems. So what I'm arguing here is a lot of the ideologies that are still around, or a lot of the ideologies people may still read, they in many cases were written for a particular political movement, a political program that no longer exists. And so if you subscribe to one of these ideologies now, you may have a deep understanding, you may have a principled understanding of it, but it does not necessarily account or amount to any particular political change, or it doesn't necessarily even amount to a true analysis of the system anymore, as a lot of these ideologies were very much tailored to a configuration of power dynamics that has changed since then, that have changed a lot since then. And just applying a particular framework that was perhaps functional 100 years ago may no longer work, and may no longer even apply in the terminology it uses. Now, for example, speaking of the opposition of capitalism and communism, if you look at it during the Cold War, there was very specific meanings to these terms. There was very specific meanings. For example, if I spoke of communists, people would likely think I'm speaking of the Soviet Union. If I spoke of capitalists, I'm likely speaking of people in the United States. There is no concrete instantiation of either of them anymore. Of either of them are no longer here in a sort of pure form, or propagating itself in a pure form. And so we're left with a kind of disagreement in definitions. You may not find two people that propagate, that are in favor of socialism, that agree on definitions of socialism, and you may not find two opponents of socialism that may agree on a definition of socialism, right? And okay, so why am I speaking of this? I'm speaking of this to actually get a deeper historical understanding of power. and of forms of government. And a deeper historical understanding cuts past ideologies that were there to be applied 100 years ago and that were made for the context of a political system that allowed radical change. Now, in the case now, we're speaking of an entirely different structure. And even if you want to speak of capitalism or socialism, you cannot really find them in their pure form anymore. I don't want to strawman particular ideologies, because if you look at the deeper writings of some of them, they did acknowledge that to some extent. There's a famous essay by Friedrich Engels, obviously a socialist, called The Development of Socialism from Utopia to Science, in which he describes that successively capitalists will come into crisis. The pure competition for cheap prices will lead to profits diminishing, and therefore larger parts of the economy will bound together to conglomerates, and these conglomerates, when they come to crisis, need to be rescued by the state. And successively, entire departments of the state are in charge of entire branches of the industry, and in that sense, the line between the state and the economy, the line between the state and the market, gets successively blurred, until in the end the state dies off and it just becomes a kind of hybrid of both. You have these massive conglomerates that at the same time are in charge of state regulation, which at the same time just works for those conglomerates, and vice versa, right? And a kind of fusing and a hybrid, a cycle that they have developed themselves into. And that is something that Engels had already described. So he had already described a state of affairs, a state of relationship between state, government, and the market, which no longer allowed for a clear separation between the state and the market. So obviously the consequences he would have taken from that would be vastly different from those of libertarians, but libertarians pretty similarly described such a phenomenon in the notion of planned chaos by Ludwig van Mises, and the notion of the intervention spiral. He speaks of an intervention of the state in the market as something that necessitates further intervention, and that intervention spiraling into a state control of the market. Now, that state is no longer the state it was in the beginning. It's no longer a state that is made up of the military and the courts and the police force. It's not made to be one that is mainly focused on the monopoly of violence, but it successively becomes a managerial state. It successively becomes an administrative state. And that is something that has been described by many others, most notably James Burnham. He's written the books The Managerial Revolution, but also The Machiavellians, where he describes what has happened in the last century from a kind of elite theory perspective. Namely, a perspective that assumes that there is a kind of permanent elite throughout historic societies, that power is always distributed in such a way that the few rule. Whether it's a monarchy in which the few are the court of the king, or it is an aristocracy where the few are bound to some sort of noble principles or religious principles, or even in a democracy, the representative system leads to a kind of permanent bureaucracy or a permanent elite of academics and experts. This was already understood by people like Bertrand de Jouvenel, or earlier, people like Rousseau, that had notions of totalitarian democracy. Even as early of socialists as Saint-Simon would have said that democracy will be nothing else but the rule of an educated academic elite, an elite that educates the people to be fit to rule themselves. They can't just rule themselves on their own, but they have to be taught and educated in the way that the people are fit to make educated decisions on how to be ruled. So even there you will have an elite. Even there you will have an academic elite. Okay. So, now, this sort of elitism, why it comes about, has been described in different ways. It has been criticized as well by people such as Robert Dahl, by people who have more pluralistic conceptions of power. But these pluralistic conceptions of power would often be focused on smaller power structures, for example, that govern a city or a city-state, a town. A kind of iron rule of oligarchy is not something that can be necessarily derived from pure data. It is something you have to postulate. It is something you have to assume. As it is with a lot of laws or definitions, it is not necessarily something that's derived from experiment, but it is something that you posit as a law because that seems to conform with your general experience. So, how would you even be able to disprove a law of oligarchy if you can always find particular people with more power, minorities with more power, and majorities with less power? Yet, there has been different attempts to explain elites, the prevalence of elites. For example, people such as Ortega y Gasset. He spoke in the Rise of the Masses. I think that was the name of the book. Don't quote me on this. He spoke about an elite naturally forming. And it naturally forms because of the coherence of a larger society. So if you are in a small society, let's say a small village, you're capable of knowing everyone. You're capable of knowing everybody in your village. However, if you're in a larger society, you are not capable of knowing everyone. So there has to be a limitation. If you then only know those ones in your village, you can't necessarily speak of a larger society because then your village is pretty isolated and you don't know anyone from the next village. So you need to make a selection. You either don't live in a larger society or you do. And if you do live in a larger society, you can only know a minority of the people from the other villages. Now, the people from the other villages, which ones will you know? You may know personal relatives that live in other villages or, people of your trade. But generally, it'll be people that are notable, people that are naturally known by many. And those people coincide with those who have power. At this point, we still haven't necessarily defined what power is. We haven't necessarily pinned it down. And that is exactly the difficulty, because you have two attempts at speaking about power. And one is trying to keep it holistic, but once you keep it holistic, you don't make internal differentiations and definitions about it. You can only give an account of it historically. You can only give an account about how it behaves without fully conceptualizing or making rigid definitions of what power actually is. On the other hand, I would speak of systemic theories of power, which need to necessarily separate it. However, they are no longer holistic. They have to focus on specific forms of power. So when I speak of notability, when I speak of particular influence that people's ideas have, then we can speak of ideological power. And ideological power is spread and exerted in a system that propagates information and ideas. Necessarily something like media, something like public media, mass media. And in another case, if you look at economic power, the system in which it spreads is a market. And power is distributed in a different way. It's distributed by means of capital. But they don't necessarily translate into each other. The richest man in the world is not necessarily the most prestigious in terms of his ideology. You can see it, for example, with Elon Musk, who is not necessarily always the public media's favorite person, but still represents, at least in public business numbers, the wealthiest man in the world. So another question that may arise here is what kind of systems of power can we look at then? What kind of systems of power do we find? We can look at many systems. The answer is as always in systems theory, is that there's not one particular way of looking at it, one particular system. It always depends on what the purpose is of the systemic analysis, what you're trying to discover, establish, or what you're trying to achieve with that analysis. And so you can separate it in different systems. The actors in your systems don't have to be humans, they can be institutions. But what some people have focused on, for example, William Domhoff, would be a 4-network theory, 4 core systems we focus on. These 4 systems are economic systems, ideological systems, political systems, and military systems. You could see those as the most prominent systems we look at whenever we speak of power. And that is also something that you have to focus on whenever power is discussed, that what kind of system of power is the person speaking of? And does one of these systems dominate or not? So that is a difficult question, because none of these systems directly act on one another. They are just structurally coupled. So, like I said, the most powerful man in the economic system is not necessarily the most powerful man in the ideological system. However, he's also not the least powerful man. He does have some ideological power. So economic power does correlate with ideological power. It just doesn't directly causally relate to it. So that is something that is important in discussions about power, is to establish what system the person is speaking of. And now we can look at it when looking at holistic analyses in the following way. We have a holistic description of power, a united whole, that we then separate into different descriptions, into different kinds of systemic analyses, and they get put back together into a more coherent whole. Don't know if the light is too strong to see this. So, in that sense, we start off with a holistic description that does not necessarily speak much more about what power is, but just describes it in a certain way. And then we continue on towards a systemic description of power, towards different particular systems, and then we combine them back into a more holistic understanding of power. And that's kind of how you arrive at understanding in general. You have an initial understanding of something as a whole, and then you dissect it into its constituent parts to then put it back together into a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. So beginning with the first initial holistic description, we can speak of the so-called Machiavellian theories of power. Theories of power that keep power mysterious, as a mysterious essence, a mysterious continued essence, as Bertrand de Jouvenel would put it in his book on power, which I, by the way, can highly recommend. One of the best works I've read in my studies on power. He focuses on the mysterious essence. So in that sense, power is something that is not necessarily inherently grasped, but you can understand that it has a mysterious continued essence. So, which means that throughout the continuous transitions you have in history, there is a core that remains the same. Why it remains the same, what it is, what it does, remains mysterious, but the fact remains that it remains the same. Not only does it remain the same, but it has a specific nature to it, and that is to grow, to impose its will on the world, and to grow its capability of imposing its will on the world. It is its own will to will. So in that sense, you get different kinds of holistic theories of power. I'd like to differentiate them in a similar way as de Jouvenel did, namely into theories of sovereignty and organic theories of power. And I've touched upon both to some extent. Namely, they kind of feed into each other, where the organic theory of power, that which assumes a will to impose its will on the world, inherent in societies, then depending on the analyses of that society, if you look at it like an organism, you can go stretch analogies very far and speak of power as kind of the brain of a society. But we don't want to go there. We can then understand sovereignty as something that maintains a continuous essence of power but changes its character. But that character never contradicts the attempt to continuously grow the power unless it breaks down on its own, unless there's a full-on societal collapse. That is obviously the exception, such as the collapse of the Roman Empire. So what that means is during the revolutions, during the end of the divine right of kings, we didn't have an abolition of power. We didn't have a dissolution or a weakening of power. It is the exact opposite. It is a strengthening of power. If you understand what capabilities a French king would have had in the 16th century, they would have been very limited. They would have been always in compromise with the local nobility, in compromise with the self-sufficiency of the farmers, of the people, of the craftsmen, until you look at kingship later on, at Louis XIV, or even later, Napoleon Bonaparte, and you suddenly had the king ruling a state machinery that was capable of raising an army of several 100,000 men to be ready for warfare. That is an increase in power, especially into the privacy of the people, that was unprecedented, and it got intensified and accelerated exactly in the time as we transitioned into liberal democracies. Now, that is the first indication of what people get wrong about power, the first indication about what this continuous essence means and where the political illusion that Ellul speaks of comes from. The illusion comes from not understanding this continued essence, from not understanding the principle that power never abolishes itself. It may abolish its own form, its old form, but only to reappear in a more intensified form. So that more intensified form is working according to different principles. It can work according to different ideologies, but the control of the apparatus of the state machinery has expanded deeper into the social stratum, into the social sphere. And you can see an acceleration and a deepening of this in phenomena such as the coronavirus pandemic in the last years, where you have societies that have become ever more liberalized, ever more opened and determined by democratic processes, no longer determined by inherited titles and inherited power, but yet a control that goes so deep into your private life, so deep into every aspect of your everyday life, that had been impossible before. The most tyrannical and autocratic regimes in the past simply did not have the means to tell people to stay at home. It was simply impossible to them to rule something like that. So, in that sense, we understand a particular core concept of the political illusion, a core concept of what people may mistake when thinking about power and looking at power. And that is that power does not abolish itself. It changes its form, but maintains its inherent continued essence. Hadis, you said you're opting for the eclectic approach over elitism. If you like, you may elaborate on that in another comment, because I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. I will just continue in the meanwhile. So, this goes deeper at something that Ellul would have referred to as the autonomy of politics. The autonomy of politics is exactly that independent, continued action and continued operation of power, regardless of the ephemeral, the surface level contingent decisions that may be done politically, and contingent elections that may be held politically. And that autonomy is maintained through sovereignty, and sovereignty is something that has gone through different generations, that has gone to different forms. We start off with something like divine sovereignty, or if you want to go back further, studying the works of Fraser, to something like an animistic notion of kingship, an animistic, holy notion of kingship that became later something like the divine right of kings, divine sovereignty. The divine right of kings has been brilliantly explicated in Robert Filmer's book, The Patriarcha, in which he explains that in the same way as the father is the head of the family back then, the king is the head of a society. And he praises, he justifies it obviously a lot with biblical text, as it's the divine right of kings, but he also praises the way in which the Roman Empire was structured, where a father had the right over the life of his own children. A father could even execute his own children. It was his right. The state would not infringe upon that right. In the same sense, it is the king who stands above the law and above the rules governing the people, and thus takes the full responsibility of ruling the kingdom according to the laws of God. Now, in that sense, that divine sovereignty had been abolished. But interestingly enough, it hadn't been abolished in the transition to popular sovereignty, in the transition to democracy. It was abolished before that already in absolutism. Many people don't know Robert Filmer was not of the same opinion as people like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke. Even Thomas Hobbes was an advocate of absolutism, and John Locke of constitutional monarchy. Absolutism was an Enlightenment philosophy, whilst the divine right of kings was a medieval philosophy, but a medieval philosophy that was so natural in a sense that it wasn't really explicated, it wasn't really formulated out until Robert Filmer wrote it in the 17th century. Obviously, it wasn't Filmer so late that would post hoc write up the philosophy that governed sovereignty in the Middle Ages. It was just something that didn't even need to be written down as a philosophy. It was something that was guaranteed just by the processes of culture. And the reason, or the pure fact that Robert Filmer wrote a defense of divine sovereignty was potentially already a symptom of its decline and its transition into something else, namely first the personal sovereignty of the king, which obviously doesn't seem like a very justified sovereignty, which is why it comparatively didn't last as long, to then transition into the personal sovereignty, namely the aggregate personal sovereignty of every citizen, and that is the popular sovereignty. The popular sovereignty of a liberal democracy. Arguably, that is the kind of regime of sovereignty that governs our world today. Yet, we need to look a bit deeper into this. There's different ways of looking at it, but what is even a formulation of sovereignty? A formulation of sovereignty is a political formula, or you could call it a political ideology. It is an idea, a set of ideas that justify the maintenance of power and the exertion of power against its enemies. In the words of Carl Schmitt, the sovereign is he who resides over the state of exception. He who can supervene all of the laws, who can overrule the laws in order for the exception to take place and the opposition, the enemy, being the enemy of the political faction, of the powerful faction, being fought, being combated. The most important political distinction, according to Schmitt, is that of friend and enemy. So, as power needs to be exerted to be maintained, this power is used to be exerted against the enemy. In that sense, the popular sovereignty is not necessarily what governs us. It is the political formula that justifies the way we are governed. This is an important distinction because most people are governed by the laws of a society. But where do these laws come from? One could argue that these laws come from religious texts, from religious laws, but that is arguably no longer the case, or at least we don't claim to religious authority anymore. Then one could say that they are governed by sort of natural principles. These natural principles are written down in constitutions, for example, in constitutions of states. And that also doesn't really solve the problem, because where do these constitutions come from? These constitutions usually are aggregates of judge and court rulings preceding the formulation of the constitution. Where does, for example, the British Constitution come from? It comes from you could say, the common sense underlying the way courts ruled up until the Constitution. And that common sense was derived from many factors, from social norms, but also from religious morals. So if then the people are in charge of setting the laws, and it's derivative of what the people want, it has become, in a sense, arbitrary. It has become an arbitrary whim of the people. And that is where the rule comes from, where the sovereignty, namely the overruling the law, comes from. Because it can't be something, it can be the laws giving laws to themselves, but there has to be something above them, a transcendent body above them that creates those laws according to their will, shapes those laws according to their will. And in the case of popular sovereignty, we again reach the problem that, like, how does a popular will get expressed? A popular will can only be expressed if people know what they want, if people know how they can express what they want, and if this way of expressing it actually has a mechanism and means of translating into policy and into laws. We can see how this leads to many problems, and this is why we have to focus back at the mysterious continued essence, and that is, there is a continued core unity regardless of the so-called separation of powers, regardless of a separation into a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive branch. There is a continued essence, a continued core about power that remains, regardless of its alleged separation. So this leads to the emergence of this kind of natural elite, the natural aristocracy that will arise. And that is not necessarily the rule of the best, as aristocracy, as the word aristocracy may convey, but it can be the rule of any minority that the political system favors. And in this sense, the passing of laws, especially of laws that strive to manage the population and strive to manage a body of a people, it ends up becoming a management duty. Because how do you enforce a law that requires a lot of effort to be enforced on a very low scale of the society? If you were so far living in a society that was determined by a kind of authority that had no interest in ruling the personal affairs of every person, of every member of society. But now that we're a popular sovereignty, the government cannot claim to be for anything else but the management of the people. And this is where managerialism comes in. This is where the majority of the decisions, we will see what it means to make decisions in a social system. The majority of decisions are no longer made in the creation of laws. They're no longer made in the exertion of popular sovereignty in the legislature. but they are actually made in the management of the people based on those laws, derived from those laws, but only because they're derived from those laws, that does not mean that they are bound to them. The notion of the living constitution exemplifies this, namely that laws can change and social norms can change so much that the way in which the body of law, the text of the constitution, is interpreted may lead to radically different outcomes. For example, when the Constitution of the United States was written, nobody even thought of it being a constitution that would guarantee women's suffrage or gay rights. Excuse me. In the same sense, we have a transition from popular sovereignty to a sovereignty of law, as Juvenal would call it, but I think that Michel Foucault describes it better. Namely with the term governmentality. Governmentality being a mentality that guides the way the people are managed. It is one that is focused with the scientific and technocratic management and control of the public. And that is something that is inherent in the technologized system, especially in the technologized system that is ruled by the political formula that strives to rule in the favor of the public, in the favor of all. So we've kind of come full circle here, because on the one hand, there is this political illusion, there is this assumption that there is a true core to power which we don't understand, which we're deluded about, which we're confused about. A kind of spectacle is made that makes us think that we're looking at the true core and essence of power, but in reality there is a deeper essence that is very different. In that sense, we can understand democracy as we see it as an illusion. But on the other hand, this mysterious essence of power is actually exactly as powerful and as much in control because it is inherently democratic, or it is inherently something that runs according to a political formula that is based on the so-called principles of democracy, on the principles of popular sovereignty. Because once the laws are made by people for the people, there is no longer an inherent restriction on what they can govern, as long as it can be scientifically and rationally justified to improve the society and improve and increase the productivity and happiness of that society. The only problem with that being that science itself here becomes a political formula. In a sense, science has become the divine principle that guides our notion of sovereignty. We could say governmentality is nothing else but the sovereignty of science. We have a separation of the state and the church, but we do not have a separation of science and the state. And in that sense, it becomes more difficult, especially with science that is affiliated with policy, to separate the policy from the science. A good example is to make comparisons. Look at the economic science of during the Cold War of the West and compare it to the economic science of the Soviet Union, and you will see massive differences. If you look at pure mathematics or you look at astronomy, they seem pretty similar in the East as well as the West. So that does not necessarily mean that science itself is always political. I'm just exemplifying the difference here, where certain sciences, specifically sciences that are about the management of the society as a whole, in that case economics, but now we can speak of other sciences such as sociology and political theories, are essentially inseparable from the notion of power. But that doesn't only apply necessarily to these areas because they are inherently political to some extent. They apply to those areas because they strive to observe in a scientific way, and the modern scientific way is one of technological manipulation, technological cause-effect relations. They try to apply this to a system that's inherently complex and cybernetic. What do I mean by that? I mean that the complexity of this society is so enormous that it is impossible to account for every phenomenon based on the principles of your model. And on top of it, it's cybernetic, meaning that it is in an interrelationship of the technical methods you apply and the humans engaged in these technical methods in the first place. That means even your description of the system changes the system. Even your description of the system is already an exertion of power. It's already an influence onto the system because it's cybernetically engaged in the system itself. That differentiates it in a sense from classical science. That differentiates it from a science where you can be a passive, separated observer, a subject separated entirely in a Cartesian way from an object. But in the case of modern science, first and foremost, most famously quantum mechanics, you cannot separate the observer from the observed. And specifically, if you look at complex systems in which you're engaged in, you also cannot separate it. A best example would be the stock market. As soon as you have certain models of the stock market, certain information about the stock market itself may change. People knowing about that information will influence the stock market, and it will need to change and may no longer be described by the model you created. So in that sense, social theories, economic theories that stem from science are in themselves influencing those social systems they're speaking about. And that influence happens according to a certain principle, and the mysterious essence of power will posit that influence is always towards an expansion of power, a growth of power. And in that sense, it doesn't matter what initial ideological camp they came from. This is where we circle back to the beginning. It doesn't matter if those theories stem from an initial libertarian principle or an initial socialist principle. They will be used and distorted according to the needs of power. They will be applied to power regardless of which camp they came from, as long as they can serve power in some way. And many purists will say that power has disfigured them, has distorted them, does not apply them correctly, but they never do. There is no instance where a political formula was actually applied one by one exactly and correctly. You could say the more it was attempted, the more horrendous the results would have been. Arguably, you could say that Joseph Stalin was someone that tried to pretty closely apply certain principles, but in order to apply them to a non-perfectly scientific and rational functioning society, an immense amount of power and brutalism was required. So this strives to give a general account of power. This is as an introduction, as a kickoff to these live streams. And you're welcome to post any questions in the live chat whenever you have them. And I will try and respond to them as best as I can. I hope this introduction has been fruitful so far. And I will stick around for another few minutes to look at potential questions anyone has. And if not, I will see you next time. I will most likely stream again in the beginning of next week. Okay. So essentially we've started off in this session with the first level, with the description of the holistic notion of power. And over the next sessions, we'll be getting deeper into the next steps. We'll get deeper into the understanding of the different systems of power, the dissection of the holism into its parts, and then to strive towards a putting it all back together. And that putting it all back together will be happening in the course on Halcyon Guild on power, beginning in the end of May. It'll be announced properly in the next weeks. Most likely it'll begin on the 26th of May. And as always, if you like to support my work, I have a tight schedule. I have to find the time to make these kind of lectures and provide this kind of information. If you like to support me in it and allow me and enable me to do more of it, please consider supporting me financially on my Substack, where you will also then be able to get the more exclusive content I publish on Substack. I'll be focusing more generally on technology and the realm of technics on Substack. And if you're interested in that, I also offered a course. Hadis, who was here in the live chat earlier, was part of that course, The Philosophy of the Machine at Halcyon. Link is in the description. If you like, you can purchase that course. And yeah, I will see you next time. Thank you, Gio Lasakis. Thanks for the compliment. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.